The Whitaker Curse, a family's darkest secrets unveiled in a stormy night, chilling thriller. Chapter 1. Echoes of the Tempest. The wind howled across the cliffside, battering the tall, imposing mansion that loomed against the darkened sky. The Whitaker estate, a monument to a bygone era of grandeur, stood isolated on its perch. Once proud walls, now shadowed by an air of decay. Heavy velvet drapes hung in the windows, stifling the light within, and the dark wood paneling that lined the walls seemed to absorb what little brightness dared to penetrate. The mansion, though opulent, bore the weight of secrets long kept, its every corner filled with an unspoken sorrow that lingered like a forgotten memory. Inside, Margaret Whitaker moved with the precision of a conductor, directing an orchestra. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over every detail, every surface, ensuring that nothing was out of place. She wore her authority like a second skin, posture rigid, her expression cool. This was her domain, and nothing escaped her notice. Tonight was important. She had orchestrated this dinner to secure the future of the family, and she would not tolerate anything less than perfection. Richard Whitaker, her husband, lounged in the study, a glass of brandy in hand. He was a man of easy charm, but his charm had long since faded in the eyes of those who knew him best. His interest in the evening's proceedings was minimal, cared little for the business deals and alliances that occupied his wife's mind. Instead, he found solace in his own distractions, his thoughts drifting as the storm outside grew louder, the rain pelting the windows like a persistent reminder of the turmoil just beyond. Elena Whitaker sat in her room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The storm outside mirrored the unrest within her. She had always been the obedient daughter, the one who never caused trouble, but the weight of her family's expectations had become a burden she could no longer bear. She felt trapped, suffocated by the walls of the mansion and the life that had been mapped out. Evening ahead filled her with a sense of dread, a gathering of people who saw only what they wished to see, blind to the shadows that lurked beneath the surface. Thomas Whitaker paced in his room, his frustration palpable. He had always been the rebel, the one who refused to bend to his mother's will. Tonight was no different. He had no interest in playing the part of the dutiful son. The storm outside called to him, a wild, untamed force that matched his own restless spirit. He longed to escape the confines of the mansion, to break free from the expectations that had been thrust upon him. But he knew he could not leave. Not yet. The dinner party was a necessary evil, one he would endure if only to satisfy his own rebellious need to disrupt the carefully curated order of things. The guests began to arrive as the storm raged on, their carriages pulling up to the grand entrance, where servants rushed to shield them from the deluge. Old friends, business associates, distant relatives, each one arrived with a smile that did not quite reach their eyes, their greetings polite but strained. The air was thick with unspoken tension, old wounds that had never fully healed, and secrets that had been buried but not forgotten. Margaret greeted each guest with a practiced smile, her gaze flicking over their faces, searching for any sign of trouble. She could feel the tension in the air, a subtle undercurrent that threatened to pull them all under, but she would not let it. Tonight was too important, and she would not allow anything to ruin it. The guests gathered in the drawing room, their voices mingling with the sound of the storm outside. Richard made his rounds, offering drinks and engaging in light conversation, his mind elsewhere. Elena stood at the edge of the room, watching the others with a sense of detachment, while Thomas lingered near the window, his gaze fixed on the tempest outside. As the evening wore on, the storm grew fiercer, the wind howling through the eaves, rattling the windows. Inside, the tension grew as well, a tightening coil that wound its way around each guest, each family member. The storm outside was a reflection of the storm within, a brewing force that could not be contained. Margaret's eyes swept the room, taking in the carefully crafted scene. Everything was as it should be, at least on the surface, but she could feel it, cracks in the foundation, the secrets that lay just beneath. And she knew, as surely as the storm raged outside, that tonight something would be revealed. The dinner bell rang, a sharp sound that cut through the murmur of voices. The guests moved toward the dining room, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Margaret led the way, her back straight, her head held high, as if daring the storm to challenge her. Whitaker family followed, each one lost in their own thoughts, their own struggles. The storm outside battered the walls of the mansion. But inside, another storm was brewing, one that would change everything, for the night was through. As the doors to the dining room closed behind them, the first flash of lightning lit up the sky, casting the mansion in a stark, white light. And in that moment, it seemed as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Chapter 2. A Stranger at the Threshold. The dining room of the Whitaker mansion was a grand and oppressive space, its heavy mahogany table stretching the length of the room, polished to a gleaming dark surface. Flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the walls, illuminating the ancestral portraits that seemed to watch over the proceedings with an air of silent judgment. The storm outside had grown more violent, the wind shrieking through the trees, and the rain pounded against the windows in an unrelenting torrent. Yet within these walls, the tension was almost palpable, an invisible force that seemed to press upon everyone in the room. Margaret Whitaker sat at the head of the table, posture regal, her face a mask of practiced composure. The guests had taken their seats, each one carefully placed according to rank and importance, their voices a murmur of polite conversation. Richard, ever the charming host, was regaling those nearest to him with a story of his latest business venture, though his words lacked the enthusiasm might have once accompanied them. Elena and Thomas sat opposite each other, their eyes downcast, as if they sought to avoid being drawn into the evening's charade. Just as the first course was being served, a sudden sharp knock echoed through the mansion. The sound cut through the room like a knife, freezing everyone in place. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound, the distant roar of the storm. Margaret's gaze snapped to the butler, who had also paused mid-step, a look of uncertainty on his face. Another knock followed, more insistent this time, sending a shiver down Elena's spine. The butler, a man who had served the Whitaker family for many years, hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Margaret for guidance. She gave a barely perceptible nod, her expression betraying none of the unease that had gripped her. That silent command, Butler turned and made his way toward the entrance hall, his footsteps echoing down the long corridor. The dining room remained eerily silent as the guests exchanged uneasy glances. The storm raged outside, a living, breathing thing that seemed determined to tear the mansion from its very foundation. The wind howled, and the walls creaked as if they too were under strain. Margaret sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the doorway through which the butler had disappeared, waiting. Moments later, the butler returned, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. Behind him, a figure emerged from the shadows of the hall, stepping into the room with a quiet, deliberate grace. He was a tall man, his clothes soaked through from the rain, his hair slicked back, droplets of water still clinging to his coat. Despite his bedraggled appearance, there was an air of authority about him, a presence that commanded attention. "I apologize for the intrusion," the man began, his voice low and even, though it carried easily across the room. "My name is Mr. Hawthorne. I believe I was expected." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, murmurs passing between them as they cast questioning glances at Margaret. But Margaret, ever composed, merely regarded the newcomer with a cool, appraising eye. "I was not aware of any additional guests this evening," he said, tone polite but edged with steel. Mr. Hawthorne smiled faintly, his gaze unwavering. "My invitation must have been lost in the chaos of the storm," he replied smoothly. "But I assure you, I have a deep connection to this house." There was something in his voice, quiet confidence that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Margaret hesitated, her instincts telling her to send the man away, to maintain the order of the evening. But the eyes of the guests were upon her, and the weight of expectation pressed heavily on her shoulders. She could not afford to cause a scene, not now. "Very well, Mr. Hawthorne," she said at last, her voice calm and measured. "You may join us for dinner." As the butler moved to seat Mr. Hawthorne at the table, the tension in the room seemed to thicken. The guests watched him with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their conversations stilled by the presence of this strange, uninvited guest. Richard offered a half-hearted attempt at hospitality, but his words trailed off as Mr. Hawthorne took his place at the table, his dark eyes surveying the room with an unsettling intensity. "Such a beautiful home," Mr. Hawthorne remarked, his voice soft but clear. "It must hold so many memories for you all." His words, though innocuous enough, seemed to carry a deeper meaning, one that sent a chill through the room. Margaret's hand tightened around her fork, her knuckles white. Richard forced a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. Elena shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Thomas, who had been glaring at the storm outside, now found his gaze drawn to the newcomer, suspicion etched into his features. "Yes, many memories," Margaret replied, voice carefully controlled. "The Whitaker family has lived here for generations." Mr. Hawthorne nodded, his expression unreadable. "Indeed, such history and such secret." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Margaret stiffened, her eyes narrowing. There was something about this man, something she couldn't quite place, that set her on edge. He spoke as though he knew more than he should, as though he were privy to the dark corners of the house that no one spoke of. "You seem well acquainted with our home," Richard ventured, trying to lighten the mood. "Have you been here before?" Mr. Hawthorne's gaze lingered on Richard for a moment before he turned his attention to the others at the table. "Once, a long time ago," he replied, his voice almost a whisper, "though the house has changed since then. People, however, they remain the same." A silence fell over the table, thick and oppressive. The storm outside battered the windows, as if seeking to enter, to unleash its fury within. But the true storm was brewing inside, among those seated at the table, where an uninvited guest had brought with him more than just the chill of the night. Margaret's heart beat faster, her mind racing. Who was this man, really? And what did he want with the Whitaker family? But even as these questions swirled in her thoughts, she maintained her outward composure, refusing to let the others see her unease. The dinner would continue, as planned, though Margaret knew that the evening had already taken a turn from which there would be no return. As the courses were served and the conversation resumed, Mr. Hawthorne's presence loomed over them all, a shadow that could not be ignored. His eyes lingered on each member of the family in turn, as though he were searching for something, some hidden truth that only he could see. And with every glance, every word, the uneasy feeling that had settled over the Whitaker mansion grew stronger, until it seemed that the very walls were closing in, suffocating them all. Margaret could feel it, unspoken tension, fear that lurked just beneath the surface. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this night would not end as she had planned. Mr. Hawthorne had brought with him something far more dangerous than the storm outside. He had brought the past, and with it, the ghosts that had been buried for so long. Chapter 3. Whispers from the Shadows. The dining room had grown colder as the evening wore on, the storm outside now a relentless onslaught against the walls of the Whitaker mansion. The candles, once bright and inviting, now seemed to flicker with an ominous uncertainty, casting distorted shadows that danced along the walls like phantoms. The atmosphere in the room was charged, the air thick with unspoken fears and mounting tension. Mr. Hawthorne, seated at the far end of the table, had begun to speak in a low, measured tone, his voice carrying easily over the muted sounds of the dinner. He spoke as though he were recounting tales from a distant past, yet there was a disturbing intimacy in his words, as if he were peeling back the layers of time to reveal the darkness that had long been buried beneath the Whitaker family's polished surface. "It's said that this house was built on old foundations," Mr. Hawthorne began, his eyes fixed on the fire roaring in the hearth. "A place where the earth holds on to its memories, where the past refuses to stay forgotten." Margaret Whitaker stiffened in her seat, her fork poised halfway to her lips. She had tried to maintain her composure, to treat Mr. Hawthorne's tales as mere fables meant to entertain or perhaps unsettle the guests. But there was something in his manner, a certainty that gnawed at her, making it impossible to dismiss his words outright. She forced a smile, though it faltered as Mr. Hawthorne continued. "They say," he went on, his gaze drifting from the flames to the guests around the table, "that the original owner of this estate was a man of great ambition, but also of great cruelty. He sought to expand his wealth and power at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing those closest to him. There are stories, whispered among the old families, of disappearances, of lives cut short within these very walls. Richard Whitaker let out a forced laugh, the sound jarring in the heavy silence. "Come now, Mr. Hawthorne, surely you don't expect us to believe in ghost stories? This is the 20th century, after all." But even as he spoke, Richard's eyes darted nervously toward his wife, seeking reassurance that he did not find. Margaret's expression had hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Hawthorne's words were cutting too close, stirring memories she had long buried. Mr. Hawthorne turned his gaze to Richard, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Ghosts, perhaps not," he agreed. "But history has a way of leaving its mark, doesn't it? And some marks never fade." Elena, seated next to her father, had grown pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had always felt the weight of the house's history, a suffocating presence that seemed to watch her from every corner. Now, with Mr. Hawthorne's words echoing in her ears, that weight felt unbearable. She cast a furtive glance at her mother, searching for some sign of comfort. Found none. Thomas, on the other hand, was glaring at Mr. Hawthorne, his jaw clenched. The stranger's insinuations had sparked something in him, a slow-burning anger that threatened to erupt. He had always resented the mansion, the expectations that came with being a Whitaker, and now this man, this uninvited guest, was dredging up the past as if it were some sort of game. "What's your point, Hawthorne?" Thomas demanded, his voice rough with suppressed rage. "Why are you really here? To tell us our family's dirty little secrets? We don't need you for that." Mr. Hawthorne's eyes locked onto Thomas's, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around them, as if the world outside had fallen away. "My point, young man," he said softly, "is that the past is never as distant as we might like to believe. It lives within these walls, within each of you. And some secrets are not so easily kept." Margaret could feel the tension mounting, her grip on the edge of the table tightening as she fought to keep her voice steady. "This is absurd," she snapped, her tone cutting. "You come into our home uninvited and start spreading lies. What do you want from us?" Mr. Hawthorne's smile faded, his expression growing somber. "I seek nothing but the truth," replied. "And the truth has a way of revealing itself, whether we wish it to or not." He turned his attention to the fire once more, voice dropping to a near whisper. "There was a child many years ago who wandered these halls, a girl with a bright future, until that future was stolen from her. She vanished one night without a trace, and it was said that the family grieved deeply for her loss. But grief can be a strange thing, and twist and turn and become something else entirely." The room grew colder still, the chill seeping into the very bones of those present. Margaret's face had drained of color, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and horror. "Stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Mr. Hawthorne's gaze was unrelenting, his words like a knife twisting in an old wound. "She was your sister, wasn't she?" he said, his voice low but clear. "The one who disappeared. They searched for her, of course, but she was never found, and some say that she never left this house." The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of Mr. Hawthorne's words pressing down on everyone in the room. Richard had gone pale, his hands trembling as he reached for his glass, only to find it empty. Elena's eyes were wide with fear, while Thomas looked as though he might explode at any moment. Margaret's voice, when it finally came, was a strangled whisper. "That's enough," she said, her hands shaking. "You have no right." But Mr. Hawthorne's gaze was merciless, his voice unyielding. "You were there that night, Margaret. You know what happened. You've lived with it all these years, haven't you? The guilt, the shame, and now it's time to face the truth." The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing closer, the air growing thinner. Margaret's heart raced, her mind spinning as she tried to grasp at something, anything that would dispel the horror of what was being said. But the truth, the terrible truth, was staring her in the face, and there was no escaping it. "No," she choked out, her voice barely more than a breath. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't my fault." But the doubt had already taken root, creeping into the minds of those around her. Richard, who had always trusted his wife implicitly, now looked at her with new eyes, his expression one of confusion and fear. Elena, who had never truly known her mother, saw her now as a stranger, someone she could no longer trust. And Thomas, who had always rebelled against his family, felt a surge of anger and betrayal, threatened to consume him. Mr. Hawthorne sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "The past has a way of catching up with us," he said quietly, "and when it does, there's no running from it." The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. But within the walls of the Whitaker mansion, another storm was brewing, one that threatened to tear the family apart. Mr. Hawthorne had unearthed secrets that had long been buried, and now there was no turning back. Truth, once revealed, could not be hidden again, and the consequences would be far-reaching. Chapter 4: The Unraveling. The storm outside had grown into a monstrous thing, battering the windows with relentless fury. Rain lashed against the glass like icy fingers, and the wind howled through the trees, its voice a mournful wail that seemed to seep into the very bones of the mansion. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from uneasy to outright dangerous, as though the walls themselves were closing in, listening intently to the dark confessions that had begun to spill out into the open. The grand chandelier, once a beacon of opulence, now flickered ominously, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched across the room like twisted specters. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone, making it difficult to breathe, to think clearly. It was as if the house had come alive, feeding off the growing animosity, urging it on, pushing it towards some inevitable, dreadful conclusion. Elena, who had always been the quiet observer in family matters, felt something within her snap. Her usual reserve was stripped away by the suffocating atmosphere, and she found herself speaking up, her voice trembling with the weight of years of unspoken grievances. "I'm tired," she began, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. All eyes turned to her, surprise flickering in their gazes. "I'm tired of pretending that everything is fine, of living in this house under your expectations with no room to breathe. You all act like this family is perfect, like we're above everyone else. But we're not. We're just as broken as everyone else. Maybe more so." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For a moment, no one spoke, the shock of Elena's outburst leaving them momentarily stunned. Then, Thomas, who had been brooding silently, let out a harsh laugh, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Finally, someone else admits it," he said, his voice tinged with bitter sarcasm. "This family is a mess, and it's because of you," continued, pointing a shaking finger at his mother. "You, with your constant demands, your impossible standards. You've never cared about what we want, only about how we make you look. And you," he added, turning to his father, his eyes flashing with anger, "you've let her do it. You've stood by and done nothing, hiding behind your books and your work. You're a coward." Margaret's face had turned a ghostly white, her composure crumbling under the onslaught of accusations. "Thomas," she started, but her voice was weak, the authoritative edge that she had always wielded with such ease now gone. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Thomas interrupted, his voice rising. "You've controlled every aspect of our lives, dictated every decision, all to protect your precious reputation. But what's it gotten you, huh? A family that hates each other? Secrets that are tearing us apart?" Richard, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, now looked as if he had aged years in a matter of minutes. The accusations leveled at him by his son cut deep, and he found himself at a loss for words, the guilt he had long buried now rising to the surface, suffocating him. The guests, who had initially been nothing more than passive observers to the Whitaker family's unraveling, began to stir uncomfortably in their seats. The tension in the room was unbearable, a living thing that wrapped itself around them, drawing them into the chaos. One of the guests, a distant cousin who had always envied the Whitakers' wealth and status, saw an opportunity and seized it. "I think it's time we stopped pretending," she said, her voice carrying an edge that had not been there before. "We all know this family isn't what it seems. We've all heard the whispers, the rumors, and now it seems those rumors are true." Another guest, a family friend who had once been close to Margaret, nodded in agreement. "It's true," she said, her voice low but firm. "There are things that have been hidden for too long, things that should have come to light years ago." Margaret, her eyes wide with desperation, looked around the room, her gaze pleading with each of them in turn. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "don't do this. Not here. Not now." But it was too late. Floodgates had opened, and there was no stopping the tide of resentment and anger that had been unleashed. The guests, emboldened by Mr. Hawthorne's revelations and by the family's own confessions, began to speak more freely, revealing their own grievances, their own dark connections to the Whitakers' troubled past. "It's not just the family," one guest said, his voice tight with emotion. "It's this house. It's always been this house. There's something wrong here, something that's been festering for generations. And now it's coming to the surface." As if in response, the mansion groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from its very foundations. The chandelier flickered violently, and a door somewhere in the depths of the house slammed shut with a deafening crash. The walls seemed to close in, the very air thickening with the weight of the secrets that had been laid bare. Mr. Hawthorne, who had been silent throughout the unfolding drama, now leaned back in his chair, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his lips. He had lit the match, and now he watched as the fire spread, consuming everything in its path. "There's no escaping it," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the din of voices and the growing storm outside. "The truth will always find its way out." The house creaked again, a sound like the groaning of some ancient beast, and the lights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and writhe along the wall. The sense of unease, of something dark and malevolent lurking just out of sight, grew stronger with each passing moment. Elena, her earlier resolve now crumbling under the weight of the revelations, felt a chill run down her spine. The house, the storm, the secrets. It was all too much, too overwhelming. She could feel the walls closing in, could hear the whispers of the past echoing through the halls, and she knew, with a growing sense of dread, there was no escape. Thomas, too, felt the shift, the way the very air seemed to hum with something dark and ancient. His anger, which had burned so brightly just moments before, now gave way to a deep, unsettling fear. He had always known there was something wrong with the mansion, something that had been lurking just beneath the surface, and now that something was waking up. Margaret, her carefully constructed world now in tatters, looked around at the faces of her family, her guests, and saw only suspicion, doubt, and fear. The truth, which she had fought so hard to keep buried, come out, and there was no putting it back. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls, and the mansion groaned in response, as if it too were caught in the grip of some terrible, unseen force. The air was thick with tension, with secrets, with the weight of the past bearing down on them all. And through it all, Mr. Hawthorne sat quietly, watching, waiting, as the Whitaker family began to unravel, piece by piece. Chapter 5. Hearst Legacy. Storm had reached a fever pitch, battering the old mansion with a relentless fury that seemed to echo the chaos within. The wind screamed through the cracks in the windows, and the rain pounded against the walls like 1,000 accusing fists. Inside, the Whitaker family stood on the brink of collapse, each member teetering on the edge of a precipice none of them had ever wanted to face. Mr. Hawthorne, who had watched the unraveling with a detached, almost predatory interest, finally rose from his chair. The room seemed to darken as he did, flickering lights dimming further, as if the very air around him was sucking the life out of the space. Its presence, once unsettling, now took on an otherworldly quality, something ancient, something that did not belong in the world of the living. "I think it's time," he began, his voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying current of menace, "that we speak of the truth that has been buried beneath this house for far too long, the truth that has haunted this family for generations." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had feared this moment, dreaded it with every fiber of her being, but she knew it had finally arrived. The weight of years of guilt, secrets kept and lies told, pressed down on her until she thought she might suffocate. Her hands trembled as she gripped the back of a chair, needing something solid to hold on to as the ground beneath her seemed to shift. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, though she already knew the answer. Mr. Hawthorne's eyes, dark and endless, bore into her. "This house," he said slowly, is not merely a structure of wood and stone. It is a living thing, a vessel for the sins that have been committed within its walls. Every lie, every betrayal, every act of cruelty has seeped into the very foundation, tainting it, cursing it. And I, he added with a smile that chilled Margaret to the bone, am the embodiment of that curse. I am here to collect what is owed. Collective shiver ran through the room as if a cold wind had swept through, chilling them all to the core. Richard, who had been silent, lost in the web of his own thoughts, looked up at Mr. Hawthorne with a dawning horror. Curse, he echoed, voice trembling. What are you talking about? Mr. Hawthorne turned his gaze to Richard, his smile widening. You've all felt it, haven't you? The weight of something dark, something wrong in this house? You've sensed it in the way the air grows thick with dread, in the way the shadows seem to lengthen, in the way the walls themselves seem to whisper at night. This house is alive, Mr. Whitaker, and it feeds on your family's secret. Elena, who had withdrawn into herself, now looked up, her eyes wide with fear. Are you saying, she began, her voice shaking, that the house, that it knows, that it's alive? Mr. Hawthorne inclined his head slightly. In a manner of speaking, the house is bound to the Whitaker family, just as you are bound to it. Sins of your ancestors, their deeds, their blood, have all seeped into these walls, and in turn, the house has become something more than mere brick and mortar. It has become a vessel for those sins, conduit for the curse that now hangs over you. Thomas, still bristling with anger, stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. This is ridiculous, he spat, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. You're trying to scare us with ghost stories. There's no curse, no haunted house. It's all in our heads. But Margaret knew better. She could feel it, deep in her bones. A truth she had tried to deny for so long now laid bare before her. The memories she had worked so hard to repress came flooding back, each one a fresh wound, a reminder of the sins she had committed. There is a curse, she said softly, her voice breaking. It's real, and it's because of me. All eyes turned to her, shock and confusion written on their faces. Mother? Elena whispered, but Margaret could not look at her daughter, could not bear the pain she knew she would see in those eyes. Margaret's hands tightened on the chair, her knuckles white with the effort. Years ago, she began, the words dragging themselves out of her like a confession long overdue. There was an accident, or, at least, that's what I told myself it was. But it wasn't. It was my fault. I made a decision, a terrible one, and it led to someone's death. I thought I could bury it, hide it from everyone, even from myself. But the house, it knows. It's always known. The room was deathly silent, the storm outside the only sound, its fury now seeming almost a backdrop to the tempest raging within the Whitaker family. Richard stared at his wife, his face ashen. Margaret, what are you saying? I'm saying, she replied, her voice hollow, that I killed someone, and I've been living with that guilt every day since. The house, it feeds on that, on my fear, my shame, and now it's come for its due. Mr. Hawthorne stepped forward, his presence dominating the room. The curse, he said, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder, is not just on the house. It is on you, the Whitaker family. It has been passed down through the generations, growing stronger with each new sin, each new lie. The storm outside, he continued, gesturing toward the windows, is a manifestation of that curse. It is gathering strength, and soon it will consume you all unless you break the cycle. Elena, tears streaming down her face, looked at her mother, her voice trembling. How do we stop it? Mr. Hawthorne's smile faded, placed by a look of solemnity. To break the curse, he said, you must confront the sins of the past. You must face the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how devastating. Only by doing so can you hope to free yourselves from the hold this house has over you. Margaret collapsed into the chair, her strength spent, the weight of her confession finally crushing her. I don't know if I can, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Richard, despite his own fear and confusion, stepped forward, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. We'll do it together, he said quietly, his voice filled with a resolve he hadn't known he still possessed. We'll face this, all of us, and we'll break this curse. Mr. Hawthorne nodded, his expression inscrutable. The choice is yours, he said, but know this, if you do not act, if you allow the past to continue to fester, The curse will not only destroy this house, but it will destroy all of you as well. The storm will rage on, growing stronger until there is nothing left. The mansion groaned once more as if in agreement, and the lights flickered violently, casting the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, Mr. Hawthorne was gone, leaving only the echo of his words and the weight of his revelations behind. The Whitakers stood in stunned silence, the reality of their situation sinking in like a stone. The house was alive, curse was real, and if they did not confront the darkness that had plagued their family for generations, they would be consumed by it. And outside, the storm continued to rage, a harbinger of the darkness that awaited them. They failed. Chapter 6: The Last Confrontation. The storm howled with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural, as if the very heavens were conspiring to tear the mansion apart. The Whitakers, huddled together in the grand parlor, could feel the weight of the night pressing down on them, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. The walls of the mansion, once a symbol of their family's legacy, now seemed to close in on them, cage of their own making. Mr. Hawthorne stood at the center of the room, his presence more commanding than ever, though his form had begun to waver, a shadow caught in a flickering flame. His eyes, dark and knowing, swept over the family, taking in their fear, their desperation. "There is only one way," he intoned, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the house. "Only by confronting the sins of the past, by seeking forgiveness from those you have wronged, can you hope to break the curse that binds you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Family, now united in their fear, exchanged glances, each of them understanding that there was no other path forward. The time had come to face the darkness that had haunted them for so long. Margaret, pale and trembling, was the first to speak. Her confession had begun the unraveling, and she knew it was up to her to lead them through this final ordeal. Her voice, though weak, carried the weight of years of guilt and sorrow. "I was responsible," she began, her words barely audible above the din of the storm. "I made a choice, terrible choice. It cost a life, and I have lived with that burden every day since. I told myself I had no other option. Truth is, I was afraid of what the truth would mean for me, our family." As she spoke, the wind outside seemed to wane, savage gusts diminishing in their intensity. The storm, which had raged so fiercely, began to lose its power, as if the mansion itself were listening, waiting. Elena, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve, stepped forward next. She had always felt the weight of her mother's secrets, though she had never understood them. Now, standing in the midst of the storm's fury, she knew that she, too, part to play. "I resented you," Elena confessed, voice trembling. "I resented the way you shut me out, the way you made me feel like I was never enough. But I understand now. You were trying to protect us in your own way. I see that now, and I forgive you, Mother." Margaret looked at her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I never wanted to hurt you." Thomas, who had always been the most defiant, the most rebellious, stepped forward, his anger now replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. "I blamed you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I blamed you for everything. For the way our family fell apart, for the way Father seemed to disappear into himself. But I see now that you were struggling, too. I should have seen it sooner. I'm sorry, Mother." Margaret reached out to her son, her hand trembling as it rested on his shoulder. "We all made mistakes," she said softly, "but we can try to make it right, together." Richard, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried a depth of feeling that none of them had heard before. "I was a coward," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I should have been there for you, Margaret. I should have been stronger for all of us. But I was too afraid to face the truth." The room fell silent. The only sound the distant rumble of thunder as the storm began to move away, its wrath abating. Mr. Hawthorne, who had watched the proceedings with a solemn expression, nodded slowly, as if in approval. "You have faced your demons," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "You have sought forgiveness, not just from each other, but from yourselves. Curse has been appeased, for now." As he spoke, his form began to fade, dissolving into the shadows of the room. The storm, which had once seemed intent on tearing the mansion apart, was now little more than a gentle rain, fury of the night giving way to an uneasy calm. Families stood together, shaken but united, as the last of the storm passed. The guests, who had been silent witnesses to the night's events, began to gather their belongings, eager to leave the mansion and its dark history behind. As the final guest departed, casting one last glance at the grand entrance hall, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Mr. Hawthorne, or rather it was the house itself, its presence lingering like a dark stain on the soul. He watched them go, his expression inscrutable, waiting for the next moment when the past would rise again, demanding its due. The Whitaker family, forever changed by the night's revelations, stood in the eerie silence of the mansion, knowing that while they had bought themselves time, the past could never truly be buried. The house, with its secrets and its curse, would remain, watching, waiting for the day when the sins of the Whitakers would once again come to light.